written an essay for The New Yorker shortly after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia about the way in which the Russian oligarchs in London had kind of put Britain in an awkward situation vis-a-vis the Ukraine war. And that was an issue I'd been thinking about. And I happened to be living in London over the summer, I guess it's the summer of 2023, and was working on a television series based on my book, Say Nothing. And I was on set one day, and I bumped into a guy who was a guest of the director. And we started talking, and he said, I might have a story for you. I know this family here in London, who are dear friends of mine, who lost their 19-year-old son recently. He died under mysterious circumstances, and after his death, they learned that he had a secret life, a double life that they hadn't known about. And he had been moving around London as a teenager, pretending that he was the son of a Russian oligarch. And that was pretty much all he had to say to me before I knew that this would be the next thing I worked on, the next story I would try and tell. I needed to figure out if the family would be willing to open up to me and tell their story. But that felt like an opportunity to take the kind of broad set of issues that I was interested in about London and how it had changed and foreign money and the kind of post-Soviet oligarch presence in the city and examine it through the lens of a very intimate story about one family and a boy who became kind of caught up in that side of the city. I think the main thing with me is I tend not to want to examine any given story or issue from 30,000 feet. I want to examine it from the ground level. A story for me is always a story about people. It's always about characters. And so whether it's a magazine article or particularly a book, I'm not really interested in doing it unless I feel as though there are really rich characters at the center of it who can kind of pull us through the complicated issues and the sort of deep history and all the rest of it. I think there's just something about us as people. We're hardwired to enjoy a story if it's a story about people. Any set of issues, no matter how complex, I think become more explicable if you can render it as a story about a set of characters and the kind of drama, the sort of little opera of what happens to a cluster of people. And so in this case, I was interested in an almost abstract way in how London has changed. I mean, it's a city I love. It's a city I lived in when I was young. I went to graduate school here. But I knew that the city had changed a lot in recent decades. And that was a story I wanted to tell, but I wouldn't have done it unless I could find a really compelling way in. And in this case, the story of Zac Brettler and his family created a kind of very human, sort of relatable, emotional point of entry for me, and I hope for readers. It's funny, I always used to say of my book, Empire of Pain, that it wasn't really a book about the opioid crisis in the US. It was a family saga, that was the way I thought of it, as a kind of a family dynasty story. But in some ways, I feel as though all my books are family sagas. It's just a lens that's particularly interesting to me. I think any of us are formed by the families that we came up in, and indeed by the generations before us. And so I'm always interested when I'm telling a story in kind of excavating a bit and figuring out, who are these people? What are their roots? Where do they come from? How were they shaped? And so in the case of Say Nothing, that meant that you had these young members of the IRA who were very influenced by the history of Ireland, by the history of their own families. In Empire of Pain, you had 3 generations of the Sacklers, and you could sort of see these certain continuities that kind of passed from one generation to the next. And because that's my approach, when I told the story of Zac Brettler, but also of the 2 people who were in the apartment with him the night that he died, Akbar Shamji and Verinder Sharma, who was known as Indian Dave, this London gangster, I wanted also to know about their family backgrounds and where they came from and the kind of prehistory. And in Zac's case, it was the story not just of Zac, but of his parents and indeed of his grandparents. And so you had these three different families that arrive in England and kind of invent new stories for themselves. You know, it's a book about London as a city. And part of what I love about this city, any big metropolis, is that one thing about cities is that they're a stage for reinvention, that people can arrive in the city and it's a little bit of a tabula rasa. They can kind of recreate themselves. They can decide, who am I going to be? And you see this on an individual level, and you see it on a family level. And so that was part of the story that I wanted to tell, was that you have these three people who are linked by this death in 2019. These three guys who were in this apartment that night. And I want to know, where did their families come from? When did they come to England? And what's that story? And then how does that kind of form these people? And I think there's a kind of interesting way when you get into the book. Certainly I found when I was doing the research that when you excavate that prehistory, it can almost seem like there's a kind of inevitability. The different roads that these people take that lead them ultimately to that fateful night on this balcony overlooking the Thames. On one level, this is a very distinctively London story. The Thames threads through the whole book. The Thames is kind of a metaphor. It comes back again, and we talk about the Thames in the time of Dickens and, the sort of slow decline of shipping and the docklands. There's a real kind of concrete specificity about London. So on one level, it does feel like a story that could only happen here. On another level, there are aspects of this story that remind me of my own country and my own city, New York, which is another big global city. I think the story of the ways in which money and foreign money and kind of influence and power can transform a city, the story of what it's like to be a young person sort of at loose in a big city, in this case also very active on social media, sort of influenced by the algorithm, the way in which that can kind of change a young person's personality and their outlook on life in their adolescence, the strangeness of being a parent of an adolescent in a city like this, where somebody like Zac Brettler kind of goes out and you don't really know who he's interacting with. He ends up in this luxury flat overlooking the Thames with people that you don't know, and he's got a kind of perception of the world that's really shaped by the people he's encountered in the city, but also by, the world as it's presented to him through his algorithm on his phone. So he kind of sees the world a bit differently than you do. All of that feels like a story that could take place in almost any city, anywhere. One of the things that's so strange about this story is that Zac Brettler, the boy at the center of it, was an upper middle class kid. I mean, he was well off by any standard, and he grows up in a very affluent part of London in Maida Vale, in a stable family with loving parents who really, there's hardly anything that this boy needed or wanted that he didn't get. And yet, he felt this kind of gnawing sense of insecurity because there was a culture in London during his life. He was born in 2000. And so his whole life is unfolding at a time when there's enormous amounts of wealth coming into London, wealthy people and, luxury cars and a sort of blingy culture of luxury products and sort of a kind of aspirational quality in which he's on Instagram and he's seeing these people who I think in some cases are pretty amoral hustlers who are out there trying to get rich quick. And so that's the culture that he's marinating in as a teenager. And in this case, I think what happened is that his sense of the world and what you should want and what you should believe in was influenced by that. And he ultimately lost his bearings. And that to me is it's a story about London, but it's a story that you could see playing out in a lot of places. The way in which the culture of wealth, the kind of siren song of wealth, the way in which our culture, I think broadly speaking now, has created a kind of hero worship around entrepreneurs and billionaires and private jets and luxury cars and all the rest of it. And I think that if you're an impressionable teenager, even one who in this case came from a pretty comfortable background, that can have a way of making you lose your way. And so it's interesting because in this case, the story ends sort of tragically, or it sort of begins tragically with Zac Brettler dying and then his parents having to figure out what happened to him and kind of where things went wrong. But I've heard from lots of people who learn this story and say, you know, some version of this happened in my family. It didn't end in the same way. The results weren't as dramatic or as tragic, but I recognize some of these same tendencies in my child or in my niece or in my cousin. Zac's an interesting character. I say character, he was a real person. I never knew him, but I feel as though I know him quite well now. Part of what's tricky about him is that he was slippery, and obviously it's partially a story about the fact that he was an imposter. He was a fabulist. He tricked a lot of people. And when you're writing about someone, it's a kind of interesting quality to explore, because Zac left a lot of people feeling very burned, you know, people who were duped by him in one way or another. And the fact that he did have so many advantages that lots of people don't, and yet felt like it wasn't enough. I can see how some people might see that and think he should have been pleased with what he had. He'd actually been dealt a very good hand, all things considered. But having said that, I think, you know, those of us who have been teenagers ourselves or who have teenage children, you realize that it's a time when your identity is kind of getting formed in real time. There are ways in which you're kind of impressionable, you're quite volatile emotionally. And in this case, I look at Zac's story and I think that for all the lies he told, the tragedy of this story is that he was going through experiences that were, you know, a fairly extreme version, but were just kind of fairly standard adolescent experiences. He took it to a place that most kids don't, and he had the terrible misfortune of falling in with some quite dangerous people. But I look at him and I see so many adolescents. I see the adolescent I was. I see adolescents I know. I'm raising 2 adolescents myself. So I'm kind of attuned to how sort of fragile and tricky a time it is. And the thing that I always think about is that if Zac had made it through that night, if he'd survived, I think there's a very decent chance that he would have actually kind of settled down eventually. You know, that he had a kind of moxie. He had a sort of chutzpah that might have served him quite well in life. Had he made it through that night and made it through his 19th year and gone on to become an entrepreneur, he could have become quite a success story, actually. He sort of had that hustle. And it's a quality that I think in other contexts we tend to admire in people. For better or for worse, we do. I think that the culture at large kind of places a premium on people who have that kind of charisma and that drive. And Zac had it in spades. In his case, the story, you know, was cut short. But when I think about Zac, I don't tend to dwell on the lies and the rest of it. I sort of think about who he could have become if he'd made it through. Part of what drew me to this story as a story is that it's a mystery. This young boy dies. How did he die? Was he murdered? Was it suicide? Was it something more exotic? And how had he kind of created this double life, this secret life? How had he gotten away with that? Who was he pretending to be? What were the origins of that? In the beginning, you think that the people who are going to be solving the mystery are the authorities. It's Scotland Yard. They come in. It's the Metropolitan Police. You know, I grew up reading Sherlock Holmes, right? There's a kind of tradition of the story in which the investigators come in and help the civilians with whatever the bedeviling trouble is that they're reckoning with. In this case, what happened was the authorities came in and said, "Oh, of course, we'll throw the full weight of the Metropolitan Police behind solving this case." There's actually a line where they said, in the end, there will be no questions that haven't been answered, which they told the family. And then proceeded to not really investigate, not in any thorough way. And so it's actually a story about this couple, Matthew and Rochelle, whose son, Zac, dies, and they then have to essentially become investigators themselves in the vacuum in which the authorities don't come and help you. They don't do what they're supposed to do. They have no choice but to become the detectives themselves. And in so doing, they kind of enter into this side of their own city, this underworld that they'd never really been fully aware of. And because Zac was kind of mixing it up with gangsters and dodgy businessmen, and there's a whole kind of subculture in London beneath the gleaming surfaces in which there's a lot of kind of transactional hustle, a lot of slightly shady things going on. And Matthew and Rochelle have to kind of plunge into that netherworld in order to figure out what happened to their son. So to me, that's a story both about their tenacity as grieving parents in getting some answers that weren't afforded to them, and about the way in which the systems and structures that should be here to look out for civilians in a big city like London have failed them. That there's the appearance of the Metropolitan Police, one of the biggest and most storied police forces in the world, you would think would be here. They'd be the ones you'd call when you're in trouble, and they would get to the bottom of it. But in fact, I think it's a story of rank institutional incompetence and even indifference when it comes to, in this case, the death of a 19-year-old boy. One of the things I found really fascinating as I got into this story is that it's partially a story about how London was transformed by the Russian oligarchs, that the post-Soviet oligarchs come to the UK in the early 2000s and they send their kids to posh schools here and they buy real estate in London and they invest, they buy football clubs, they kind of come in and they really change the city, the culture of the city. But as I dug into it, what I found is that it didn't really start with the Russians. In fact, before the Russians, you have the Americans. And that you get the deregulation of the financial markets here and the financial sector and a wave of bankers, predominantly American bankers, who come in the Thatcher era in 1987. And so it's actually the Americans who come in and start driving up the real estate prices. And, you suddenly get good restaurants and, all the rest of it, kind of all these kind of, these mod cons, and the luxury that a certain kind of wealthy new arrival expects. That story really starts with the Americans. And in a strange way, the Americans kind of soften the place up for the Russians who come subsequently. So it's interesting because I do think that there's a quote at the end of the book from The Gilded Age, the Twain novel. And it's actually from the introduction to the English edition where they're sort of trying to explain America, the kind of rampaging capitalism in America, to an English audience. And I should say, as an American in London writing this book about England, I'm very, very conscious of the fact that, first of all, a lot of what I'm describing, you would recognize in my own city, in New York, or in any big city in America. You'd recognize it in Dubai. You'd recognize it in different cities around the world. But also that some of these, to my mind, nefarious changes in London were prompted not just by the Russians, but by the Americans. think one of the things that I love most about the work that I do as a journalist and an author is that I am constantly having to kind of go outside my own comfort zone and my own circle and my own life and meet all kinds of different people. And I sort of meet them where they are. So it could be undocumented immigrants from China. It could be very senior government officials. It could be professors at universities with PhDs. It could be gangsters, murderers, people who've kind of lived their lives in the underworld. And so you have all these different types of people, and I have to find them and find a way to forge a relationship, sort of find some conversational wavelength where we can see each other and communicate, ideally in a way that feels pretty kind of forthright and candid. And what that means for me is I have to keep myself very open and often listen without judgment. And it doesn't mean that I'm not going to pass judgment, because if you read my work, it's there. I mean, I'm certainly not trying to kind of whitewash anything that anybody does when I sit down to write. But if I come and meet you, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, my first objective is to make myself open to hear your story in your words and try and understand the world as you see it, even if I don't see it that way, maybe especially if I don't see it that way. So that's what I'm always trying to do. And it doesn't always work. I mean, sometimes people refuse to talk to me. Sometimes they start talking to me and then they change their minds and they go dark on me. When it works, it's really extraordinary. And it feels, on the one hand, like the most natural thing in the world, in the sense that I think that all of us have a story to tell. All of us really, in the end, want to be understood. And on the other hand, like a real privilege for me to be somebody who kind of hears people's stories, and ideally hear stories that haven't been told before. So in the case of the Brettlers, this is a family that lost a child in very dramatic fashion and decided, really even before they knew that Zac was dead, actually just when they knew he was missing, they didn't want this story to get out. They just sort of felt as though this is our private family business. And for several years, they, I think, really struggled in a kind of quite isolated way with the death and the aftermath. And they couldn't talk about it publicly. They didn't want to. And eventually we met, and part of the case I was making to them was, I think it's probably time for you to tell your story. And they weren't convinced right away. I mean, it was a process. But eventually they did, and they did in this very kind of fulsome, intimate way. And as a writer, it feels like a privilege to be able to hear it and tell the story. One of my dearest friends in the world, who's somebody who's one of my first readers, I always show him my work before almost anyone else. And he read the book and he said it's so interesting because the first half of the book you think it's a mystery, and then in a kind of strange way it turns out it's really a book about grief and about parental love. And that was kind of my experience too. What drew me to the story on the front end was the intrigue, and it's just such a wild story of this young fabulist in London pretending he's the son of a Russian oligarch, and as a teenager going out and kind of mixing it up with these quite unsavory figures in London, and the idea of these grieving parents who have to kind of solve the mystery, not just of how their son died, but of who he really was in life in a way that they didn't understand at the time. All of that was what kind of pulled me into the story, and I hope pulls readers in as well. But then there was this sort of interesting turn for me as I got to know Matthew and Rochelle and Zac's brother Joe better, where I realized that in a strange way, it's a story about parenthood and about loss. And, without going into too much detail, there's this backstory about the fact that Zac Brettler had two grandfathers who survived the Holocaust. And I think when I started writing, what I found so compelling about that is that we're all formed by our own family histories. And I was thinking about London and the fact that Zac was kind of an imposter. He'd sort of reinvented himself as the son of an oligarch. So it turns out he had these two grandfathers and they both escaped the Holocaust, but both of them basically lost their entire families. And so they show up in the UK as teenagers and they have to totally reinvent themselves. It's like you're a tabula rasa, you've got no family and you're here alone. And there's this question of, well, who will I be? Like, who will I be now? And that to me was sort of an appealing idea as a literary theme, this kind of echo of these young people reinventing themselves in London as teenagers. And as I got to the end of writing the book, after so many months of talking with the Brettlers, I was at dinner with them one night. And one of the things that I had sort of been wondering at was just their ability to keep moving in the face of loss. They had just gone to see a concert. They go to a lot of concerts, Matthew and Rochelle, and they love the Grateful Dead. And they'd gone to see the Grateful Dead play at the Sphere in Vegas. And I think I had this moment where I sort of thought, God, if I were you and I'd lost a son, it would be so hard for me to enjoy anything. I just don't know that I would know how. And yet here you are kind of living this active life, trying to kind of solve the riddle of Zac, but at the same time, you still have friends, you still have family, you have another son you're looking after. And I sort of wondered, how is it that you're equipped? Like, how do you keep putting one foot in front of the other? And I kind of asked them a version of that question, and they both started talking about their fathers. And the idea that they had grown up with these fathers who lost everything as teenagers and somehow had to find a way to keep moving forward and, in the case of their fathers, fall in love, get married, have children, build a career, build a life, build new generations of this family that was like almost entirely wiped out. And so the idea that Matthew and Rochelle grew up with this example of how to kind of live defiantly in the face of loss was so profound and something that totally snuck up on me, that I thought that the kind of backstory of these grandfathers in the Holocaust was purely a matter of teenagers reinventing themselves on this kind of stage in London where you can become somebody totally new. And it crept up on me that actually, really, this is a story about how do you keep moving when you've lost something as important to you as a blood relative, as a child.